Our presenter today is Jim Handy, and the topic is the surprising history of peasant abundance. Like small farmers in Canada today, peasants have always suffered from bad press, often considered unproductive, synonymous with poverty, and forced to give way to more efficient farmers. Historian Jim Handy shows us that, in fact, peasants have always been the most efficient producers, using scarce resources available most effectively. He suggests that even in the face of almost constant persecution and repression, peasant communities have provided numerous benefits and a livelihood that was often surprisingly abundant. Jim Handy is a professor of history at the University of Saskatchewan, where he has taught for 36 years. He's the winner of numerous teaching awards and the author of more than 50 articles and chapters and 5 books. And his books include Apostles of Inequality, Rural Poverty, Political Economy, and The Economist, 1760 to 1860, and Tiny Engines of Abundance, A History of Peasant Productivity and Repression, and both were published in 2022. So Jim, we'll get you to launch your presentation. You can start sharing your screen and go ahead with your talk. Thanks so much.
Thanks for everybody for this and for being here and for inviting me. I see in the participants lots of people I know, so that's great. I should mention that this talk is drawn from one of the books that Kathy mentioned, a book called Tiny Engines of Abundance, A History of Peasant Productivity and Repression, that was published by Fernwood in last year, 2022. The painting in the background of this image comes from the front of the book. I don't know if you can see that, which is a wonderful painting by a Cachical Maya painter named Pedro Rafael Gonzalez Chavajay from San Pedro La Laguna in Guatemala, and I thank him for allowing me to share that. If you can go forward one in the slides. So we're all constantly told about the efficiency of modern industrial agriculture on the prairies. We are told that supporting such agriculture is a kind of moral imperative, our duty in helping feed the hungry millions in the world. At the University of Saskatchewan, where I work, that duty is part of the mission the university points to, and it somewhat self-righteously declares itself to be the university the world needs. Go to the next one, please. Most of us are also, the next slide, please. Most of us are also accustomed to images of peasants. Does that work? Can we have the next slide? Drawn from histories or popular literature or film that portrayed peasant life as kind of dreadful, bereft of joy, full of poverty and constant deprivation. Peasant agriculture is often portrayed as being kind of idiotic wretchedness, as one description of Irish peasants in the mid-1800s termed it. Abundance is certainly not one of the words usually associated with peasant livelihoods. Nonetheless, in this book, I suggest that very often, very small scale, and I'll call them peasants, agricultural pursuits have been and are, both historically and contemporarily, tiny engines of abundance. And that understanding that source of abundance might be important. As the title of the book suggests, I also think it might be useful to understand how and why peasant livelihoods have been attacked and maligned so consistently. To understand why peasant livelihoods seem to have been so threatening to so many people in power, with power, over time and around the world. So before going into this talk, let me mention, I'm a historian. Historians tell stories. But it's a bit inaccurate to say, as people commonly do, that historians tell stories about the past. When historians set out to tell stories, they always have one foot in the past and one foot in the present. And if historians had another foot, it would be in the future. As Louis Napier said almost a century ago, historians remember the future and imagine the past. A comment that has befuddled undergraduate history students ever since. What Napier intended to point out was that historians decide on the stories they are going to tell and how they are going to tell them, because they believe their stories will have some sort of contemporary relevance. And that it requires some vision of the future, remembering the future, as Napier says. So historians always believe the stories they tell are important in the present, else they wouldn't choose to tell them or tell them in the way they tell them. But I should mention, historians very often leave it to others to be most explicit about the contemporary relevance. They tell the stories and let others talk about the relevance. So I mostly follow that practice in this book and will so in this tale. I tell stories set in different locales at different time periods about peasant productivity and the ambushes they faced. In the discussion period afterwards, I hesitate to call it question and answer because that might suggest I have answers. I'm glad to talk about the relevance, contemporary relevance, and as well as any other questions or comments you might have. So let me begin by talking generally about what I do in the book, and then I'll proceed to detail more fully one of the stories, and then conclude with some brief thoughts. I've been writing about peasants and their troubles, mostly in Central America, off and on for about 40 years. So I was aware before starting the book that common portrayals of peasants were not often very accurate. And it occurred to me that a book that explored similar troubles as those I had witnessed in Central America in various places around the world at various times might be kind of interesting to write. So the book focuses on 5 different stories about peasant productivity and abundance and attacks on them. In England and Wales in the century between 1750 and 1850, at the time that England was supposedly in the midst of a much vaunted agricultural revolution. In Jamaica, in the period just preceding and following slave emancipation in 1834, in Guatemala in the 20th century, in Nigeria in the 20th century, and in Kerala, India, from the passage of an important agrarian reform law in 1969 to the present. I had an idea when I started doing the research that I would find that this general description of peasant livelihoods as wretched and their agricultural pursuits as idiotic was not really historically accurate. But even so, I was amazed at the evidence for quite remarkable productivity of peasant agriculture that I discovered. And the portrayals of determined self-reliance and simple abundance that became apparent if one searched hard enough for the evidence and read carefully enough. I recognize that for those of us raised on tales in which peasant is kind of synonymous with poverty, tales often masquerading as history, this is kind of counterintuitive. So let me provide you first with one description from my examples to suggest what this combination of relative productivity on small bits of land and the modest abundance it provided might mean. And here's a bit of history. So in some dates. In 1798, Sir Trevor Bernard, who was a very wealthy a very wealthy, large English landowner. Sorry, Jill, I forgot to tell you to go forward. Could you go forward 2 slides? Described a very small farm near Tadcaster in England. Go forward another slide 2, please. He had often admired when passing on the road. Thanks. One day he stopped to inquire about the farm and its owner. According to Bernard's note, the farm was rented by an old man named Britton Abbott and his wife. His wife's name's not given in the account. The farm consisted of a cottage and a rood of land. A rood of land was 1/4 of an acre. In Bernard's note, I quote, "This land was enclosed by a hedge containing the cottage, 15 apple trees, 1 green gage, 3 wine sour plum trees, 2 apricot trees, several gooseberry and currant bushes, abundance of common vegetables, and 3 hives of bees. Abbott and his wife of 45 years got 40 bushels of potatoes from the 1/4 acre and had raised 7 children and lived, according to Bernard, very happy together on the land." If we could go forward 1 more, Jill. It turned out that Abbott was not unusual. With some digging, it became apparent that the English countryside was populated by tens of thousands of Britton Abbotts, achieving remarkable productivity from very small pieces of land, and most of the time, living very happy together on these little bits of land. And this was true not just of the English countryside at the end of the 18th century. What became apparent as I dug deeper into the history of peasant livelihoods in different locales at different times was the Britton Abbott story. His successes and his satisfactions with his life on the land was repeated time after time in place after place. In each of these locales and time periods I discuss in the book, we can discern similar patterns. The agriculture described was immensely varied and diverse, but there were all sorts of things in common. So let me remark on a couple of the elements of the Abbott's little farm that are repeated elsewhere in the stories I examine in this book. Abbott and his wife had a 1/4 acre of land. The peasants I describe in various places in the book farmed usually somewhere between this 1/4 acre and at the upper limit, 5 acres of land. The Abbott's land housed the cottage and a remarkable array of permaculture and a complex polyculture that provided remarkable returns year after year and generation after generation. Along with the multitude of trees in Abbott's land, one description of a good cottage garden from this period suggested a garden would include, and I quote, radishes, parsley, beans, cabbages, shallots, chives, leeks, carrots, potatoes, turnips, onions, parsnips, and kidney beans. A cottager would as well raise bees, chicken, geese, and a pig or 2. As in Abbott's case, a little bit of land, the usually suggested optimum was 2 to 3 acres of garden land, would feed a family and provide significant excess for the market. Actually, in this case, in Britton Abbott's case, we are first introduced to the family when Sir Trevor meets his wife returning from selling vegetables and honey in the market. Britton Abbott and his wife worked occasionally for the farmer who rented him his land, but this wage labor was considered to be a welcome addition to the family income, not the mainstay. To suggest how the story of the Abbott household and the wonderful productivity that so intrigued Sir Trevor is similar to that of millions of peasant households around the world at different times, Let me provide you with just a few more descriptions of the complex and intricate polyculture that sustained and sustain peasant households around the world over time. And if we could go to the next slide. In Guatemala, Maya peasants usually, we went two, I think. Thanks. In Guatemala, Maya peasants usually engage in milpa cultivation that is on the face of it deceptively simple. A polyculture composed of the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, with a mix of some small herbs. On closer inspection, there is nothing simple about milpa agriculture. There are about 6,000 varieties of maize or corn in highland Central America. A Mayan peasant with an acre or two of land might grow 5 or 6 different varieties, depending on circumstances, microclimates, what was grown last year. There are 2 main types of beans. They need to be matched with the corn varieties and are dependent both on soil conditions and the types of squash that will be grown. There are 5 or so common varieties of squash grown, each with their own characteristics. Herbs are chosen for their nutritional value and the nature of the soil and the climate. But that only begins to capture the complexity of Mayan milpa agriculture. All of this is most often grown under a canopy of permaculture crops that provide just the right amount of shade and sun while augmenting both income and sustenance. And all of this is mixed with small animal husbandry and sustained by manuring and fertilizing. And a good Mayan farmer understands full well the different characteristics of sheep and goat manure mixed with straw and ash. And all of this needs to take into consideration a complex hydrology on sloping or flat fields. If we could go to the next slide, please. In Nigeria, Kafir peasant farmers historically constrained by repression. Sorry, Jill, the next slide. Historically constrained by repression to farming on the seemingly inhospitable slopes of the Jos Plateau, have for generations crafted remarkably productive livelihoods from this challenging environment. One careful study from the 1950s and 1960s provides this description of Kafir farming. A Kafir family might have about 2.5 acres of land. The fields are extensively terraced and furrowed in ways to allow for just the right retention of water on sloping land. Like Mayan farmers, the Kafir diet and agriculture is based primarily on a trinity: sorghum, millet, and cowpeas. But like Maya, they also grow a diverse range of other crops: aca or hungry rice, pumpkin, gourds, groundnuts, cocoa yams, sweet potatoes, cassava, okra, maize, string beans, and a host of others. The crops are chosen not simply to meet the needs of the household and the market, but to help bind soils, to replenish nitrogen, protect against wind, provide privacy and fodder, and importantly, to spread out both the harvest and labor demands so that almost no labor is hired. All of these are intercropped so closely in Kafir fields that virtually no weeds appear. There's virtually no forest, either on the hills or at the base of the plains, but there are plenty of trees, either as part of the household or bush gardens. These include a whole host of trees: oil and fan palms, camarium, locust bean, papaya, mango, fig trees. And most households have a few cotton bushes to spin their own textiles. Like Maya, the Kofur employ an intricate system of manuring and fertilizing using a mix of goat manure, kitchen scraps, and ash to maintain fertility. I'll give you one more example. If we could go to the next slide, Jill. Or take this description of a hut dweller's garden in Kerala, India from 1995, and I quote this description. The spaces between the coconut plants are used to raise an array of intercrops, resulting in multi-storied cropping pattern with distinct canopy stratification. Thus, perennial crops such as coconut, acornut, jack mango, cashew, tamarind, and forest tree species occupy the upper layer. Pepper, clove, nutmeg, cinnamon, and so on occupy the second layer. Banana, cassava, yam, and the like occupy the third layer. Ginger, turmeric, pineapple, vegetables, and guinea grass occupy the ground layer. The resultant canopy architecture often approaches that of a tropical rainforest in its structure and density. So it should be apparent by now that despite the diversity of all of this agriculture, that all of this also demonstrates some similar characteristics. It is all based around a complex polyculture employing a dizzying variety of crops in permaculture. Crops that capture as much solar energy as at various heights as possible, whose roots tap different levels in the soil, crops which, along with the harvest, perform a variety of other functions. Bind to loose soils to help prevent erosion, add nitrogen, protect more delicate crops from the wind or too much sun or too much rain. Crops that are chosen because they do well together, do well in pockets of sandy soil or in rich soil. Crops that are chosen because they can be planted when the ground is dry or when the ground is wet from recent rains. Crops that are chosen because they can be harvested early or late to spread out labor demands and the availability of food over the year. Or crops that are so chosen simply because the peasant household likes the taste. In all examples, there is painstaking attention paid to maintaining soil fertility. All of this requires an intricate understanding of place. Such agriculture cannot be easily replicated by outsiders or transferred easily from one place to another, because all depends on polyculture. All the examples I detailed in the book resist even limited mechanization. They all use the scarce resources, land, soil fertility, and water most efficiently. And they do so by using the most available resource, labor, most fully. This is the rub. Because profitable returns for each hour of labor are traditionally very low, peasant agriculture in all places is considered terribly inefficient by the standards of economists or development specialists. That brings us to the second focus of my book, a history of repression of peasants. Let's return briefly to Brinton Abbott to explore this. And Jill, if we can go to the next slide. The description of Abbott was interesting to me, partly because it appeared at a time when the much vaunted agricultural revolution was occurring in England at a time, and it was a time when England was engaged in what was described as a war on cottagers. That is, eliminating both the cottages that housed a large portion of the rural population and the bits of land they farmed. as farms became larger and employing more capital. Abbott and his family had been on this piece of land that Sir Trevor described for about 20 years. Before that, they had another small farm, but had been thrown off the land when the neighboring farmland was enclosed, the estates enlarged, and Abbott's customary lease extinguished. Abbott had been left landless and destitute at the same time as his wife was pregnant with his 7th child. He had only by a stroke of luck gotten access to his new piece of land on secure rent and rebuilt his life. Abbott was one of the lucky few. All the peasant households I examined in this book were attacked in a variety of ways. They have been thrown off the land as part of the war on cottagers in England, or forced to provide coerced labor on coffee fincas, or forced off the land in the name of efficiency in Guatemala, considered to be the raw material for an economic development based on, quote, unlimited supplies of labor in Nigeria, or the careful rhythms of a complex agriculture were disrupted by the generic calls of a chemically dependent future through the Green Revolution in Kerala. Given how readily apparent the productivity of peasant agriculture was to anyone who wished to see it, one wonders, or at least I wondered in this book, why it has been attacked so relentlessly. The nature of the attack on peasants has been richly varied. One reason is simply that more powerful people wanted peasant land or labor. But most often, attacks on peasant livelihoods have been accompanied by justifications that progress required the dispossession of peasants or demanded that they be coerced into changing their ways. Peasants have prevented progress, it is said, because they were not efficient, because they stood in the way of profits, because they refused to labor often or cheaply enough for those who had capital, or simply because they were hidebound and idiotic traditionalists. Sometimes there were deliberate policies meant to ensure that peasants felt hunger and cold and deprivation as a spur to greater exertion or to prevent them from having too many children. If we could have the next slide, Joan. One constant approach has been that peasants, despite all logic from anyone who spent any time in the countryside, were lazy. This laziness was often attributed to race, but just as often it was, we were told, because peasants didn't have enough wants beyond good food, a comfortable home, and the embrace of family and community. This issue of wants is surprisingly important in all of these stories. By the end of the 18th century, political economists and others had come to the conclusion that the driving force for economic development was the expansion of wants, or needs, as it was often called. As Thomas Robert Malthus said in 1820, that's a picture of him on the slide, it is unquestionable that wealth produces wants, but it is a still more important truth that wants produce wealth. The flip side of this was that if wants were achieved too easily, people would not be industrious. Political economists, government and colonial officials, and by the middle of the 20th century, development specialists were all dismayed, they asserted time and again, by peasants' apparent satisfaction with little. or put differently, the relentless self-reliance. Very often this had a racial component. It was not just peasants, but Mayan peasants in Guatemala. It was Negro ex-slave peasants in Jamaica, or colonized African peasants who were satisfied with too little. To explore how all of this takes shape, let me end this discussion by recounting a little more fully one of the stories in the book, that of peasants in Jamaica just before and following emancipation from slavery in 1834. And if we could have the next slide, Joe. I found this perhaps the most interesting chapter to write in the book, partly because much of the evidence for this comes from a series of British Parliament Select Committee reports and evidence, beginning from before emancipation in 1834 and continuing into the 1860s. Reading these Select Committee reports, each one of which consists of thousands of pages of interviews and interrogation of witnesses, most often required reading against the grain, that is, finding evidence that was contrary to what they wished to present. For historians, such exploration is always the most fun and rewarding. So let me give you just a little bit of basic history. Jamaica was Britain's most lucrative colony for much of the 18th century. It, along with the French Saint-Domingue, were the two most prominent sugar-producing regions of the world, and also the destination for most of the slaves taken from Africa during the transatlantic slave trade. In 1834, however, Britain finally ended slavery in all of its possessions. To compensate slaveholders in Jamaica for their loss of property, they were given £20 million from British taxpayers. To further lessen the impact on slaveholders, and as the Colonial Office said, to accustom ex-slaves to wage labor, an apprentice period was introduced, meant to last 6 years, in which slaves were required to work for 40.5 hours a week for their owner for free, but were then expected to work extra hours for wages. Testimony suggested that this was perhaps the most brutal period for ex-slaves. As one ex-slave said, it was like the owners wanted to squeeze all the remaining juice out of the slaves. This picture in the bottom right is from an ingenious device for disciplining slaves, and that was developed in Jamaica in this period called the thread mill. Used only in Jamaica, as far as I can tell, ever. The apprentice period ended in 1838. One of the major conflicts revolved around ex-slaves' success as peasant farmers and their apparent unwillingness to provide the required labor for sugar, at least for the wages the owners wanted to pay. This requires a bit of background. And if we could have the next slide, Jill. Even during the worst period of slavery in the 18th century, Jamaican slaves had proven remarkably able to build community and some independence for themselves. One of the ways they did this was increasingly to create a second existence, a not so secret life, a not so secret peasant life for themselves as peasants. Allowing slaves to grow their own food made good sense for plantation owners, as it reduced dramatically the cost of slave upkeep. Slaves typically had access to two types of land under slavery: slave gardens near their huts in the slave village on each plantation, and what were called provision grounds, which were usually in hilly or mountainous land on the estate, but some distance from the plantation itself. Over time, this arrangement became the accepted custom and then considered both by slaves and their masters as a right. That is, slave gardens around their huts and the provision grounds were seen to be almost as if they were slave property itself. Plantation owners' attempt to interfere with such rights very often led to widespread unrest. By all accounts, and they are multiple, from visitors, plantation managers, and the reports of select committees, these grounds were very productive. Like English cottagers, slaves took every opportunity they could to work on their gardens close to their huts, despite the fact that they often had to work 16-hour days during the sugar harvest. As one slave owner described it in a select committee, it was usual for them to spend their horn blows, that is, their dinner and break times, working on their gardens. In the gardens, they planted the most used vegetables, and like abbots, these home gardens were also stuffed with permaculture. Provision grounds were farther away, and opportunities to work on them were more limited. And the size of provision grounds, therefore, was mostly dictated by the available labor time. Few slaves planted more than 2 acres of land. Over time, it became first expected custom and then law that owners needed to allow slaves every second Saturday to work on their provision grounds, though many provided more than that. These grounds, too, were extremely productive. In the 1780s, for example, one agriculturalist touring Jamaica remarked, and I quote, "It is astonishing what quantities of the common necessaries of life it will produce. A quarter of an acre of this description will be fully sufficient for the supply of a moderate family and may enable the proprietor to carry some to the market besides." The list of what they grew on these lands was most impressive. A description from a slightly later period recounted how provision grounds provided, and sorry, it's a long list, apples, oranges, pomegranates, figs, cashews, bananas, dates, plantains, ackee, breadfruit, mangoes, potatoes, yams, cassava, peas, beans, acar, choco, and Indian corn. The remarkable productivity of such lands was partly due to the fertility inherent in new land reclaimed from the forest, but it was equally the result of the dynamic mix of an eclectic blend of crops from America, Europe, and Africa that used every niche of land. Jamaica's vibrant village and city market culture dates from this period, and the bulk of the produce on sale in the markets was both produced by and owned by slaves. This presents an interesting legal, philosophical, and historical dilemma for people who are interested in it. What happens when property owns property? Under slavery, slave owners by and large embraced this production. As I said, slaves producing their own food reduced the maintenance costs for plantations, while the whip of the overseer ensured their labor on sugar. Save diligence in peasant pursuits was applauded, therefore. After 1934, all of this changed. Especially after the apprenticeship period ended in 1838, sugar planters complained continually that they could not get labor for sugar, at least not at the wages they wanted to pay. They tried expelling slaves from their slave gardens and then denying them access to provision grounds. Even so, newly freed slaves found other ways to get land. They bought land on time from Baptists who were creating refugee communities in the highlands, or they had accumulated enough from their own production or wage labor to purchase land in the interior, what one slave owner at a select committee described as buying mountains. Or they simply squatted on unoccupied land in the interior of the island. As during slavery, we have multiple descriptions of the quite remarkable productivity of these lands. As ex-slaves freed from the labor demands of slavery could turn their land into the most abundant gardens. One description in the 1850s of a peasant household of less than 2 acres identified breadfruit, bananas, yams, oranges, shaddocks, cucumbers, beans, pineapples, plantains, besides many kinds of shrubbery and fruits of secondary value. A more contemporary description of these described them as multi-cropped food forests. And along with the items mentioned above, suggested a plot would also contain intensively cropped corn, dasheen, Irish potatoes, cassava, tomatoes, onions, beans, peppers, and more, while also raising chicken and goats and ducks, and of course, pigs. As one supportive Baptist minister said, we have the germ of a noble, free peasantry. Or as the single sympathetic governor remarked in the 1840s, I don't suppose that any peasantry in the world have so many comforts and so much independence or enjoyment. The response from the Jamaican Parliament, the British Parliament, and to a large extent the British press and publications was to me very interesting. Though the select committees were provided time and again with descriptions of both the wonderful productivity and the hard work of these settler peasants, the rhetoric soon turned to damning them as lazy and indolent to explain their unwillingness to work sugar for wages. As in Guatemala, one part of this became a racist argument that Jamaica could never progress and sugar could never prosper without some form of coercion applied to Negroes, because to expect them to want more than a bare minimum necessary for subsistence would do, and I quote, violence to their nature. Could we have the next slide, Joe, please? Unless some form of coercion was used. Unless some form of coercion was used, it was argued, the peasants would continue sitting yonder with their beautiful muscles up to their necks in pumpkins while the sugar rots around them because labor cannot be hired. In the words of the influential writer Thomas Carlyle in 1850, in a work entitled Occasional Discourse on the Negro Question. This racist argument about wants that was applied to peasants more generally was often taken to silly extremes. One select committee, for example, goes on at some length questioning witnesses about whether, and I quote, Negroes in Jamaica wore shoes, and if so, how often and for how long, making a big to-do about the testimony from one witness that they wore shoes to church, but took them off and put sandals on if they were going to walk long distances home, which supposedly demonstrated their lack of culture. But even the decidedly serious Economist newspaper counseled that Jamaican peasants needed to feel, and I quote, the beneficent whip of hunger and cold to inspire their labors. There was nothing funny about the restrictions the British and Jamaican governments brought in to try to impoverish peasant agriculture in Jamaica to make them feel this beneficent whip of hunger and cold. Laws were passed barring Sunday markets. Restrictions on vendor licenses were introduced, making it illegal to sell outside of their home district. New taxes were introduced that fell hardest on peasants. Vexing laws were introduced that, for example, forbade peasants from taking any measures against cattle that entered their fields from large estates, but allowed landowners to shoot peasants' pigs, sheep, and goats that they encountered on their estates. Most damagingly, selling land in small lots of land was forbidden, and new campaigns were mounted to evict squatters from all land in Jamaica. If we could have the next slide, Joe. The result of these increasingly draconian attempts to impoverish peasant agriculture had what could have been the expected result. In 1865, when peasant settlers attacked a couple of estates near Morant Bay around a dispute about trespassing, the governor declared the island to be in full unrest. In response, 85 peasants were killed by troops. Another 354 people were executed, and more than 1,000 peasant households were burned to the ground. As the governor suggested, the response was, and I quote, "so prompt and terrible that it is never likely to be forgotten." In the aftermath, more stringent laws against peasant livelihoods were enacted, while land in the highlands was auctioned off in huge lots to foreign, mostly American, landowners. Peasant agriculture in Jamaica never really recovered. I guess we could have the next slide, Jill. What all of these stories have in common, I think, is the following. In all examples, we have wonderful evidence of the remarkable productivity of peasant polyculture using the scarcest resources, land, fertile soil, and water, most efficiently, precisely because they employ heaps of the most abundant factor of production, labor. What also is revealed in all of these examples is how such peasant production, coupled with purposefully limited needs or wants, led not to wretchedness, as most elite commentators tried to argue, but abundance in most of the things most valued. These stories also illustrate how determinedly peasant livelihoods have been attacked and maligned at the behest of those wanting more of their labor more cheaply in the name of the state or economic development, or those dismayed by the simple abundance peasant livelihoods have provided. At the very least, I think this history suggests we might need to reassess a history of peasant livelihoods and perhaps come to appreciate what they have so argued constitutes a good life. Thanks. That's it for my talk. I should point out that Fernwood would very much like you to buy a copy of the book, and you can buy so from the web page up here. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jim.